All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about is just some basic concepts when crafting prompts. These are things that are going to appear on and off through pretty much the rest of the course when we get into more specific situations, but nevertheless, these things are absolutely critical to keep in mind with every single prompt that you write because they're just going to apply in almost every situation. So the first thing here, we'll start off with things that you should generally do. Right, so these are recommendations here for writing prompts. The first thing that you should always make an effort to do is to be specific. So if you are going to give someone, let's just go back to the directions metaphor that I've been using. If you're going to give someone directions, you don't just say, well, just drive toward your destination, right? That's really very, you would never do that because that would not be very helpful. And yet, it's amazing how many people do something very similar with generative AI when they type a prompt like, what should I eat tonight? You should say something like, recommend some, let's say, vegan recipes for 4 people that use carrots, because I have a lot of carrots in my fridge, something like that. And that's going to give you a much more specific answer than the first one. And ultimately, that's going to be much more useful to you. Now, the important thing to understand about that, though, what I just said, is that if you ask something very vague, ChatGPT is generally still going to give you a very coherent answer. And that can actually be more of a problem than anything because it prevents you from realizing just how bad the prompt that you wrote was. So that's something to keep in mind here, is that as you're honing your prompt writing skills, keep in mind that even if you're writing a bad prompt, ChatGPT is generally still going to give you an intelligent sounding answer. So in other words, just because you get a good answer doesn't necessarily mean that the prompt was good. Prompt engineering, as you'll see as we go through more specific situations, is just as much about getting consistent good answers as it is about getting a good answer in the first place. All right, so the next thing here is to think about context when writing your prompts, right? This is kind of like knowing your audience, right? If you're giving a speech in front of lots of data scientists, your speech is going to be significantly different than if you're giving a speech in front of, let's say, a group of construction workers, right? There's just a lot of different, there's some very different knowledge bases at play there, and so the way that you communicate with those groups is going to be significantly different. Now, with ChatGPT, you have to keep in mind that even though it sounds like a human, it's not a human, right? That should be kind of obvious, but people still will ask it questions that suggest some sort of knowledge or some sort of social awareness, which in general it's not going to have, except in a very linguistic. So in other words, tailoring your prompts to fit the AI's style and knowledge base, right? Keeping in mind that it doesn't know current events, at least not the most recent current events, makes it much more likely to get a response that makes sense and is more useful, right? So instead of asking things like, why did the stock market do what it did today? You could ask it something like, the stock market took a huge hit today in this sector of, so many percentage points. What are some possible things that could have contributed to it? Right? Things like that, actually giving ChatGPT the context that it needs is going to ultimately lead to much better responses than if you just kind of assume that it knows everything, which, as we've already established, it doesn't. All right, so the third bullet point here, the third recommendation is to use examples when possible in your prompts. So let's say that you want ChatGPT to do something fairly novel, right? Maybe you want it to format its responses in a specific way or something like that. Well, more often than not, the easiest way to do that is going to be to give it examples of what you want. So if you want it to maybe generate a list of, let's say that you want it to generate test data for a program that you're writing. This is a pretty regular thing that I do as a software developer. Well, you're going to want to tell it, generate me, let's say, 20 fake profiles for users in comma-separated value format. right? And you could even give it examples, as I said here. You could say, for example, John Smith, comma, 23, comma, hair color brown, something like that. And that'll really help ChatGPT give you the exact data in the exact format that you're looking for. And this really goes back to context, right? When you give examples in your prompts, you're essentially asking ChatGPT or you're essentially giving ChatGPT, rather, some additional context. You're actually showing it what it is you want. And this can be especially useful if you're asking it to do something creative like write a story or generate a piece of artwork, right? By giving examples, you can really help set a clear path for the generative AI model to follow. And just to give you another example of this, let's say that you're using ChatGPT to fill out some kind of form for your job, right? Let's say that there's a pretty tedious form that you have to fill out on a regular basis for your job. Well, by giving it examples of previous forms that you've filled out, you're going to help ChatGPT do a much better job when you ask it to fill out forms for novel situations. So even though examples and correct answers aren't a part of ChatGPT's training, right? Since it's unsupervised learning, they can actually be a very useful thing to include in the prompts that you use. All right, so those are really the three main concepts that are going to be in common across pretty much any situation where you're hoping to use prompt engineering. Let's talk now about some things to avoid doing in your prompts. And some of these are direct opposites to the do's that we've added, but I've included them here just to make it super clear. The first thing here is not to be ambiguous, right? If you give ChatGPT an ambiguous prompt, as I've said, it's still going to try and answer that the best that it can, but you might get a completely different answer than what you're looking for. Ultimately, if the prompt is vague or somehow unclear, generative AI tools might not understand exactly what you're asking for, and there's a pretty good chance that they'll give you an answer that's a little bit off from what you were hoping, right? So, if you ask it, an example of this would be if you ask ChatGPT to write something cool or give me an idea for a cool business, something like that. Well, those are pretty ambiguous because ChatGPT has no idea what cool is going to mean to you, and it's really just ultimately lacking in details, right? And going back to the recipe example that I used earlier, if you ask it, what should I eat tonight? ChatGPT has no idea what your dietary needs are, what your preferences are, what you have in the fridge, and ultimately, you're just going to end up most of the time with a response there that you can't really use, right? If ChatGPT gives you a recipe and you happen to not have those ingredients or can't access those ingredients easily, that output's going to be pretty useless, and you're going to have to go back and try asking again. All right, so anyway, the second thing to avoid here is making your prompts too long or too complex. If you've ever been given a very long, complicated set of instructions for some task, right? Let's say that you ordered some furniture online and you now have to assemble it. Well, I think many of you will understand that those instructions can oftentimes be unnecessarily long or complex. And if that's ever happened to you, you know how confusing and frustrating it can be. Well, it's really the same for generative AI models. If a prompt is too long or packed with too many ideas, generally what happens is that the AI model will just kind of get lost, right? I use quotation marks around that because obviously it's not actually getting lost, but the idea here is that the response that you're going to get in those cases can tend to be a little bit scrambled or just a little bit haphazard, so to speak, and it's not going to be what you want in many cases. So if you have a prompt that's too long or too complex, you're generally going to want to break that down into multiple prompts, right? So don't just copy and paste the entire instructions that you've been given. for whatever task you're doing, you're going to have to actually go about it in a more step-by-step manner. This is something that we'll see how to do a little bit later as well when we get more into specifics. But so let's say that you wanted to do something like write a book. Well, you wouldn't just start off by telling ChatGPT, write me a book that follows this plot line. You describe the plot line and includes these characters and touches on these themes. And, you can probably imagine how that prompt could go on a lot longer. You're going to want to break that up a lot more into, starting off by thinking of a general plot line. You could ask ChatGPT, what are some give me some intriguing ideas for plot lines that would fit into a novel of about 200 pages, something like that. And then you can kind of work iteratively to get to the final product, if that's what you want to do. That's just an example, right? So the last thing here that you should avoid, actually the second to last thing, there is one more bullet point here. The second to last thing is to avoid making unethical requests. And in general, this just goes along with whatever the company is that's published this model. In this case, it's going to be OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT. It's going to mean adhering to that company's usage policies. So OpenAI has a lot of different policies for working with ChatGPT and using it in the real world. And really, you should make sure before you use this in a professional context that you at least understand the basics of those policies and don't try and use it for something that it wasn't meant to be used for, right? So if you ask it to generate a script that will help you hack into Wi-Fi routers, in general, ChatGPT is going to refuse that because it's been set up to do so. Just some other things to avoid along these lines of making unethical requests. You should generally avoid asking for harmful or offensive content because besides being against OpenAI's usage policies, it's also, in general, ChatGPT is just going to refuse to help you with your request. All right, and the last thing here that you should avoid doing is expecting ChatGPT to do the impossible. All right, so what I mean by this is it can be very easy when you start working with ChatGPT and you start getting used to the tremendous power that it gives you. You can really kind of lose track of what it is that's really possible to do. And when ChatGPT doesn't give you the results you're looking for, it can be a little bit frustrating. So on a personal note, I'll tell you a little story about a project that I was trying to do. One task that I've been very interested in using ChatGPT for is language learning, primarily because I've found that it's very good at generating example sentences for different words or grammatical concepts. This is something that I found that language learning books and courses are usually lacking in many cases, is just when you're trying to learn a new word or a new grammatical concept, it can be very helpful to just see a ton of examples that demonstrate how that word or grammatical concept is used. So, obviously I started off by using ChatGPT to start generating simple examples, but then I started thinking, well, what if I could learn all of the vocabulary, all of the main vocabulary of a language, and all of the grammatical concepts of a language just by reading a short book in that language, right? And this led me to the idea of having ChatGPT take, let's say, the top 1,000 or 2,000 words in the target language, let's say Spanish or French or Chinese, whatever, and generating a story that uses all of those words as few times as possible. Now, that sounds like it makes sense, perhaps, but in reality, writing a story that uses the top 2,000 words in a language as few times as possible, ideally only once to make sure the story is nice and short, that's a pretty impossible task if you think about it, because how could you use one word only once and still have a storyline of any kind? So in many cases, it may not be immediately obvious that you're asking ChatGPT to do an impossible task, but based on its output, in my case, the result was just gibberish. ChatGPT did try to generate stories that included a lot of those words, but they didn't make any sense. They had no plot whatsoever. In those cases, you'll get a sense that it's more difficult than you might have thought just by the output that you get, right? It's going to be, as I said, generally gibberish or not remotely what you're looking for. So anyway, these here are the top do's and don'ts of writing basic prompts for ChatGPT. Obviously, these are general concepts that are going to apply in pretty much any situation. But later on in the course, we'll actually get into seeing how we can use these things in more specific situations and some of the other do's and don'ts that apply to more specific situations.